April 28, 1945, Benito Mussolini, once the feared dictator of Italy, stood silently in front of a stone wall. Beside him, his mistress held tightly to his arm. Moments later, both lay dead. But what followed shocked the world. Their bodies were transported through the streets of Milan. Crowds gathered, tension erupted. The dictator who once ruled by spectacle met his final act in one. It was a reversal of fear, a day when history flipped. How did it come to this? How did a schoolteacher's son rise to absolute power, plunge a nation into war, destroy lives, and rewrite the future of half the population? This is not just the story of a dictator. It's the story of how ambition turns into control, how fear infects a nation, and how his obsession with power led not only to war, but to policies that reshaped and restricted the lives of millions of Italian women. Benito Mussolini was born in 1883 in a quiet town in northern Italy, but there was nothing quiet about his childhood. His father, Alessandro, was a blacksmith and a revolutionary. He praised Marx, idolized anarchists, and believed in violence as a tool for political change. His mother, a devout Catholic school teacher, offered order and discipline. Mussolini grew up trapped between the Bible and the hammer, between rigid morality and radical rebellion. By the time he was 10, he was already showing signs of what was to come. He was intelligent, sharp-tongued, and often violent. At school, he stabbed a classmate with a penknife. The reason? A minor insult. Mussolini was expelled. It wouldn't be the last time he used violence to silence opposition. As a teenager, Mussolini discovered the power of words. He was a gifted speaker, fiery, persuasive, and theatrical. He read voraciously, diving into socialist theory, Nietzsche, Garibaldi, and revolutionary manifestos. But for all his education, he never let go of his fists. Teachers feared him, classmates avoided him. But the ideas, the dangerous, electrifying ideas, kept coming. He believed Italy was weak, that the monarchy was corrupt, that the elites were out of touch. He wanted change, not gradual reform, but revolution. In his 20s, Mussolini joined the Italian Socialist Party. He became a schoolteacher for a brief time, but it didn't last. His real calling was journalism. He started writing for socialist newspapers, slamming capitalism, praising workers' uprisings, and calling for class war. He didn't just write, he provoked. He wanted people angry. He wanted them ready. In 1910, he became editor of Avanti, the Socialist Party's official newspaper. Under his pen, circulation soared. So did his influence. Mussolini was no longer a fringe agitator. He was a rising star. But in 1914, everything changed. When World War I broke out, Italy was divided. Most socialists opposed the war, seeing it as a capitalist conflict. Mussolini at first agreed. But then, suddenly, he didn't. He began writing editorials demanding that Italy join the fight. He believed war would toughen the nation, purge it of weakness, and reshape its destiny. It was a stunning betrayal of socialist values. The party expelled him, his friends abandoned him. But Mussolini didn't care. He started his own newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, the People of Italy. And with it, a new ideology was born, a fusion of nationalism, militarism, and authoritarianism. It wasn't about class struggle anymore. It was about power. It was about Italy, strong, united, ruthless. In 1915, Italy entered the war. Mussolini enlisted. He served on the front lines, saw battle, and was wounded by a mortar shell in 1917. The injury ended his service, but not his mission. When he returned home, Italy was in chaos. The economy was wrecked. Veterans returned to find no jobs, no pensions, no future. Political factions clashed in the streets. The monarchy was floundering. Socialists and communists were rising, and Mussolini saw an opening. He had no party, no army, no real base. But he had an idea. If Italy couldn't be fixed through politics, he would seize it through force. By now, Mussolini was no longer just a former socialist. He was becoming something far more dangerous, the architect of fascism. And the world would soon learn what that meant. From socialist journalist to betrayer, in 1912 Benito Mussolini was not yet the dictator history would come to fear. He was a fiery, defiant voice in Italy's socialist movement, wielding his pen like a weapon. As editor-in-chief of Avanti, the newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party, he stirred unrest with sharp words. He denounced the church, ridiculed the monarchy, and called for strikes that rocked cities. To the elite, he was dangerous. To the working poor, he was a hero. But beneath the revolutionary rhetoric was something else, a hunger for power. Raised in a household of radical ideas, Mussolini had violence in his blood. His father, a socialist blacksmith, named him after a revolutionary. By 16, Mussolini had been expelled for stabbing a classmate. Anger wasn't something he learned. It was something he carried. By 1914, as war erupted across Europe, Mussolini initially echoed the Socialist Party's anti-war stance. But soon he broke ranks. He called war a purifier, a tool to forge national unity and masculine strength. He was expelled from the party he once led. But Mussolini didn't fall. He adapted. With support from pro-war businessmen, he founded Il Popolo d'Italia, a newspaper that replaced socialist ideals with nationalist fervor. His writing shifted. No more talk of class struggle. Now it was about destiny, sacrifice, blood. In 1915, Italy joined World War I. Mussolini enlisted and served on the front lines. He was wounded in 1917. But the experience only deepened his belief in violence as political purification. Italy after the war was chaos. Veterans were unemployed, inflation soared, the government was powerless, strikes, riots, and revolution threatened to tear the nation apart. In 1919, Mussolini created the Fasci di Combattimento, the combat leagues. They weren't politicians. They were thugs, angry veterans and nationalists in black shirts, marching through towns, cracking skulls and burning union halls. The police turned their backs. Landowners and factory bosses offered quiet support. Mussolini lost the 1919 elections, but he saw something more powerful than votes: fear. He embraced it. By 1921, Mussolini had forged the National Fascist Party. It wore the mask of legitimacy, but behind it stood gangs with brass knuckles and clubs. Fascist squads took control of towns. People didn't vote for them. They submitted. Then in October 1922, Mussolini made his move. He threatened a march on Rome with 30,000 black shirts. The government wavered. The king could have stopped him. He didn't. Instead, he handed Mussolini power. At 39, Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy. Not by revolution, not by election, but by intimidation. He had betrayed socialism, betrayed peace, betrayed the people he once claimed to fight for. But to him it wasn't betrayal, it was the beginning, the bloody rise of fascism. Mussolini arrived in Rome not as a conqueror, but as a savior. That was the illusion. He wore tailored suits, he spoke of unity. But behind the speeches was a growing army of fists. Over the next 3 years, he dismantled Italy's democracy brick by brick. Opposition newspapers were shut down. Political enemies were harassed, beaten, or disappeared altogether. The parliament still met, but it was increasingly irrelevant. In 1925, Mussolini dropped the mask. He declared himself Il Duce, the leader. He was no longer a politician. He was a dictator. He created a one-party state. Secret police tracked dissent. Children were taught to praise him in school. He controlled the press, the courts, the army, and the fear that pulsed through Italian society. For those who resisted, there was violence. For those who obeyed, there was ritual. Fascist parades lit the streets. Posters of Il Duce covered city walls. Speeches echoed in every square. Mussolini wasn't just a man. He was a myth being built in real time. And myths don't tolerate challengers. Blackshirts continued their terror. They invaded homes. They beat critics in the night. In rural areas, they tied suspected communists to trees and flogged them with castor oil until they vomited blood. It wasn't just brutality. It was theater. Mussolini believed fear was more powerful when it was seen, when it echoed, when it whispered from one household to the next. He promised order, but he delivered submission. He crushed trade unions and centralized all worker organizations under fascist control. Strikes were outlawed, so were free elections, so were voices. The church, initially wary, was brought to heel. In 1929, Mussolini signed the Lateran Treaty, recognizing Vatican City and earning the Pope's blessing. Now even God appeared to back Il Duce. Italy was no longer a democracy. It was no longer a kingdom. It was no longer even a state. It was a stage, and Mussolini was always at center. He posed on balconies. He thundered in stadiums. He raised his chin and puffed his chest, until even his silence demanded applause. But behind the pageantry, a nation trembled, and the blood that had brought him to power had only begun to flow. The peak of power, and his deadly alliance with Hitler. By the late 1920s, Mussolini ruled unopposed. Italy had become a machine, uniformed, obedient, and silent. Every child recited his name. Every adult feared it. But Mussolini wanted more than obedience. He wanted empire. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia. His forces used chemical weapons and bombed civilians. The League of Nations condemned the invasion but did nothing. For Mussolini, silence was permission. Italy claimed victory in 1936. Mussolini declared a new empire from a balcony in Rome. The crowd roared. But the cost, in blood and reputation, was immense. At first, Mussolini dismissed Hitler as a crude imitator. But as Hitler's power grew, Mussolini saw an opportunity. In 1936, they aligned under the Rome-Berlin axis. A year later, Mussolini backed Franco in Spain. By 1939, he signed the Pact of Steel. Mussolini hesitated as Hitler started World War II. Italy wasn't ready, but he feared appearing weak. So in June 1940, he declared war, believing victory would be swift. Italian troops failed in Greece, North Africa, and the Balkans. Mussolini had overreached. His armies were ill-prepared. His dreams of conquest crumbled. Then he followed Hitler into even darker territory. He joined the invasion of the Soviet Union. He enacted racial laws targeting Jews. The man who once stood for workers had become complicit in fascism's worst crimes. By 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. Italy was collapsing. Mussolini's empire, built on myth and fear, was falling apart. The man who once ruled by spectacle and violence now faced a reckoning he couldn't escape: the war on women. Italy's other battlefield. Mussolini didn't just silence his enemies with bullets. He silenced half his nation with laws. To reshape Italy in his image, Mussolini declared war on women. They were no longer individuals with ambitions, intellect, or dreams. They were producers of babies, symbols of the fascist future. And under his rule, womanhood was rewritten into a weapon of the state. In 1927, he launched the Battle for Births. He wanted to grow Italy's population from 40 to 60 million. But this wasn't a call for family values. It was state-sponsored coercion. Women with many children were rewarded. Medals, money, even public ceremonies. But those who stayed single, taxed, pressured, shamed, he outlawed contraception, banned abortion. Even female doctors were discouraged from speaking honestly about reproduction. Some women were pushed into arranged marriages. Others were examined to determine if they were fit for childbirth. By the 1930s, Mussolini made it clear a woman's only role was at home. Laws restricted women to just 10% of public jobs. Later, even private companies were told to fire female workers. Thousands of educated women, teachers, lawyers, civil servants, were pushed out. Magazines echoed fascist slogans. Schoolbooks taught girls that true virtue came from motherhood. Churches praised large families. The message was relentless. Raise babies, serve your husband, don't question the regime. Meanwhile, working-class women still labored in factories and farms, with worse pay, harsher hours, and no rights. And if a woman wanted to escape a violent husband, she couldn't. Divorce was outlawed in 1930. Even if abandoned, a wife had no legal way to seek protection or support. Mussolini claimed he was protecting morality. In truth, he was enforcing control. But women resisted. In secret, midwives shared birth control. Underground groups spread banned materials. Some women even risked arrest to speak out. And when the war came, when Mussolini joined forces with Hitler, it was women who formed the backbone of the resistance. They hid Jews, delivered secret messages, fought in the mountains as partisans. One dictator tried to erase them, but they wrote themselves into history anyway. The fall, betrayal, collapse, and desperation. By the summer of 1943, Italy was a country in ruins. Bombs fell from Allied planes, cities burned, morale shattered. Mussolini, once the all-powerful Duce, now watched helplessly as his grip on power dissolved. On July 24, 1943, the fascist Grand Council turned against him. Men who once swore loyalty now voted to remove him. The next day, King Victor Emmanuel III summoned Mussolini to the palace. There was no ceremony, no warning, just quiet words. He was dismissed. Mussolini left the palace in silence and was immediately arrested. He was shuttled between remote locations, eventually imprisoned in a mountaintop hotel in the Gran Sasso. Italy, now under Marshal Badoglio, surrendered to the Allies. The country switched sides. German troops flooded in. But Hitler hadn't given up on his old ally. In September 1943, German commandos launched a daring mission. Operation Oak. Gliders landed on the mountain. Without firing a shot, they rescued Mussolini. He was thinner, grayer, defeated. Hitler installed him as leader of a puppet regime in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic. But it was a hollow title. Powerless, propped up by SS guards, Mussolini knew he was merely a symbol. The Republic was drenched in violence. Resistance fighters fought village by village. Reprisals were brutal. Innocent civilians were executed for every partisan attack. Mussolini rarely appeared in public. He spent long days isolated, writing, brooding, trapped in a role he no longer controlled. By April 1945, Nazi Germany was collapsing. The Allies were closing in. Partisans controlled much of northern Italy. He made one last attempt to flee. Disguised as a German soldier, hidden in a convoy headed toward the Swiss border. But it didn't work. On April 27th, Italian partisans stopped the convoy near the village of Dongo. They searched the vehicles. In one, they found a pale, silent man in a German coat. The next day, Benito Mussolini, once the ruler of Italy, stood in front of a stone wall beside his mistress, Claretta Petacci. The dictator's fall was complete, and what came next would shock the world. The execution, a brutal ending on Italian soil. April 28, 1945, the final chapter. At dawn, a partisan named Walter Audizio, codename Colonel Valerio, received orders from the National Liberation Committee. Mussolini and Claretta Petacci were to be executed. No trial, no speech, only justice, swift and final. Around 2 p.m., Audicio and a small group of partisans arrived at the farmhouse where Mussolini was held. They ordered him and Petacci into a waiting car, a red Alfa Romeo. The ride was short and silent. The car stopped in the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. Mussolini was told to stand in front of a stone wall. Petacci refused to leave his side. She clung to him. Audicio raised his submachine gun. At 4:10 p.m., the shots rang out. Mussolini was struck first. Petacci screamed and lunged toward him. A second burst of gunfire silenced her. But it didn't stop there. The partisans unloaded their weapons into Mussolini's already lifeless body. Dozens of bullets, some say over 40. Their corpses were thrown into a truck, along with other executed fascist officials, and driven toward Milan. But this wasn't about hiding the evidence. It was the opposite. By the early hours of April 29th, the truck arrived at Piazzale Loreto. 9 months earlier, fascists had executed 15 resistance fighters in that very square. Their bodies had been dumped like garbage, left in the sun for hours as a warning. Now the tables had turned. Mussolini's body was dragged into the square and dumped in the same spot. A crowd gathered, first hundreds, then thousands. They kicked his corpse, spat on it, fired more bullets. Petacci's body, too, was mutilated. Then someone found a metal beam at a nearby gas station. With meat hooks and rope, the bodies of Mussolini, Petacci, and 4 other fascist officials were hoisted upside down. The symbolism was clear. Humiliation for a man who had ruled through fear. A dictator displayed like a carcass in the center of the city he once controlled. For some it was justice, for others, vengeance. Even Winston Churchill, who had opposed Mussolini in war, called the public mutilation excessive. But for the people of Italy, after 20 years of dictatorship, it felt like the final exorcism. By the afternoon, authorities ordered the bodies taken down. They were placed in crude coffins and taken to the city morgue. But even in death, Mussolini's story wasn't finished. The secret afterlife of Mussolini's corpse. In the days following his execution, the Italian government faced a problem. What do you do with the body of a dictator whose death sparked both fury and fascination? Authorities feared Mussolini's grave would become a shrine for fascist sympathizers. So they buried him in an unmarked grave at the Musocco cemetery, outside Milan. No ceremony, no marker, just silence. But Mussolini would not stay buried. On Easter Sunday, 1946, a group of neo-fascists broke into the cemetery. Under the cover of night, they exhumed Mussolini's body and disappeared into the countryside. For months, the government had no idea where he was. The theft became known as the macabre pilgrimage. The body was hidden in various locations, churches, monasteries, even inside a trunk in a car garage. The group who stole him believed Mussolini deserved a proper burial. And they weren't alone. As the Cold War deepened, anti-communist sentiments in Italy grew. Right-wing politicians began lobbying for the return of Mussolini's remains to his family. After 11 years in hiding, the government relented. In 1957, his body was returned to his birthplace, Predappio. There he was buried in a family crypt. The tomb was plain but unmistakable, his name carved in stone, his bust placed above. Since then, the site has become a magnet. Every year, neo-fascists gather in Predappio to pay homage. They wear black shirts. They give Roman salutes. They call him Il Duce. To others, it's a place of historical reckoning. Tourists, scholars, and curious travelers visit to witness the grave of a man who changed history and paid the price. Even in death, Mussolini casts a shadow. Lessons for America and the world. Mussolini's rise didn't begin with violence. It began with speeches. He promised strength, stability, national pride. He told Italians that democracy was weak, that the press lied, that only he could fix the chaos. And in desperation, they listened. They traded freedom for order, debate for obedience, truth for myth. At first it felt like victory. Trains ran on time, streets looked cleaner, the flag flew higher. But underneath the surface, the cost was mounting. Dissent was crushed. Education became propaganda. Women were silenced. Minorities were targeted. Enemies were invented. War became inevitable. And when the illusion of control finally shattered, the people were left with ruins. Mussolini's story is not just about one man. It's about a nation, seduced by certainty, destroyed by dictatorship. For Americans and for the world, his legacy stands as a warning. Because authoritarianism rarely begins with tanks in the street. It begins with fear, with division, with a leader who insists he alone can save the country. And it ends, always, with a reckoning. Democracy is fragile. History is loud. And the lessons of Il Duce should never be forgotten. What do you take away from Mussolini's story? Was he a cautionary tale of ego gone unchecked, or a mirror reflecting what fear can do to a nation? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, if it shocked you, or made you think deeper about history and power, please consider subscribing. More stories like this are coming. Stories of men and women who changed history, some for better, many for worse. Until then, remember, history doesn't just repeat, it warns. Thank you for watching.